It would be about strength, but it would be about strength in terms of what I believe strength is. And that's not necessarily physical strength. It can be, sure, but it's also the strength in yourself to be honest and to be open and to have emotions and to understand them and have emotional strength and emotional intelligence. And look, there are so many men now, so many more than I think people realize, that think you have to do certain things and not talk about certain things. There's still so many people like that. And it's like, that doesn't help anyone. And I say it in the book. We've created a society that values stoicism, an illusion of toughness, over the ability to cry. Like, come on. I would much prefer to have you as a friend if you were able to cry in front of me and able to show emotions. That is huge. And I respect people so much more that can have that strength, because being able to show your emotions, that is an incredibly brave thing to do.
Ben, thank you very much for coming on. It's been an exciting week, hasn't it?
Thank you so much for having me on, Fergus. Yeah, it's been it's been a crazy week. It's been so wild. Very very busy. I've just had a lem sip this morning. I think things are starting to catch up with me a little bit, but yeah, it's a very fulfilling week in my life, actually.
You're an author now. How does it feel?
That sounds so weird. I haven't got used to that at all. Like, we did when it on launch day, when it launched, whenever that was, some Thursday that feels years ago. It's actually probably like last week. I did my first podcast was that morning with someone, and she introduced me as an author, and I was like, what on earth? How's this happened? There was me at school having my extra English lessons, like learning how to handwrite with in this little cupboard with this extra support teacher, because I couldn't spell anything, I couldn't write, and I'm like, I'm actually author now. It's very weird. It's all very very bizarre, but I'm so proud of being able to actually done it, and I'm so proud of what the book is now.
It must be a real gratifying. I mean, it's funny because the day before, technically, I think by definition you weren't an author, and then on that Thursday you all of a sudden were. So I think the gratification of that day coming to fruition must have been. Did you feel that parameter shift, or because you'd done the work, were you were kind of already there, proud, or was it when you actually launched it and had people in the room? Is that when it really felt real?
I don't know when it felt real. There's lots of different moments where we celebrated, and each one, when I look back, it sort of became more and more real. So obviously, you've got the moment I actually finished writing my first copy last summer. That was a huge moment, and lots of champagne was had between me and my editor back then. And then the moment we sent it off for proofs and we got our first proofs back and read that, and we were like, "Oh my god, it makes sense. This is amazing." And then the first time, the final proofs, when it was finally we submitted and we confirmed, and then we had the moment where they sent me my book, so I had to hold it for the first time. That was an incredible feeling. Then the moment we launched it, then the moment you see it in a shop in real life, then when the moment you see it in someone else's house, and then when you start getting the response back, especially that we've had this week, when you see, because even though it feels real for a long time, I didn't know that it was going to be as effective and as useful as I wanted it to be. So there's been lots of moments that I've sort of been just feel surreal, felt surreal. And yeah, it's there's been a lot of celebrations at different moments in this timeline.
It's interesting that you use the word useful as a way of describing it, because that implies there's a much bigger mission to this, which we obviously know that there is. And it's probably worth just rewinding to ultimately the reason why you've been on this journey. You've been campaigning for 4 years now, I believe, isn't it? And ultimately it all comes from your brother Sam. So without giving too much away, just if you're happy to just explain a little bit about the bigger mission for you and why this is so important, and why ultimately for you the book is a delivery mechanism for that mission, rather than just another book on the shelves encouraging people to think about things in different ways.
Yeah, so I'm going to cast us back to 2017, before the pandemic, and a number of other things happened. So in 2017, I was 17 years old, and I had no idea what mental health was. I didn't know. That's not something anyone had talked to me about. It wasn't something that was ever really something I was conscious of. I know, like, every so often someone would say something, it would come up in conversation, but it's not something I knew the definition of. I didn't know what depression was, anxiety, or any of these things. And then, anyway, my brother Sam was diagnosed with clinical depression in September 2017, and my mum told me after dinner. She kept me after dinner and was like, "There's something I need to tell you. Sam was diagnosed with clinical depression." And I just, you just don't. I just didn't think about it. I didn't know what that meant. I had no idea what that meant. I was like, if I'm sad, I'm going to go for a run. I'm going to feel happy. I'm going to put some songs on. I love putting songs on and just dancing around the kitchen if I've had a bad day because it makes me feel happy. And I couldn't understand how you could be diagnosed with depression and just and not just like make yourself happy by doing something happy. And 3 months later, January 2018, Sam took his own life at home, where I am now, where I'm recording this, and that was, well, without a doubt, the most horrific experience of my entire life. He took his own life after dinner on that Sunday evening. My mum and I found him, and I had to do CPR for 25 minutes. Like that, there is no words I can use, and I've tried very hard because I've written a book about it. But there's no words I can use that can possibly even scrape the surface of how awful that was as me. And really, after Sam died, so many of his friends and so many of my friends and so many of the people around me started coming forward and talking about their own experiences. And I realized that actually almost everyone I knew had some sort of connection with mental illness or some sort of connection with something that was going on in their own lives. And it sort of made me just want to do stuff. Like I just saw that Sam had died, and I was like, well, we've got to do more to stop other people from feeling the same. We've got to stop other people from suffering and not wanting to talk to people about it. And 4 years later, I'm still going, still with that same mission of just we've got to stop this same thing happening to other people. And I think with the mental health crisis that we're in, I do think it's a crisis. You know, what gives me a lot of hope from my point of view and from the conversations I have is I think of all the issues we face as a society, there is real possibility here to create solutions, and there's real possibility to solve this. And I'm really excited by that possibility to solve this and the possibility to help people. And we are making progress, and that's why I wrote the book, because I want to be part of that process, and I want to get it in people's hands, and I want to teach people about my experience and how to look after each other and how to look after yourselves and what needs changing in the world, and just offer my angle on what's happened, why it shouldn't happen, and what we need to do to stop it from happening.
And you've immortalised Sam somewhat in the process as well. So actually, why don't you just tell us a little bit about him, your memory of him? Who was he as a person, and where does your memory of Sam sit front of mind?
Yeah, I mean, so honestly, I look back and he was so funny. Like he was really funny. He was funny in a way that almost crossed the line, but it was but it was really good. Like he'd just sometimes I don't know, he'd like get some video or something on his phone, and he'd share it to us after dinner, and he'd be laughing so hard. And then the fact that he found it funny would make us funny. He was sporty, he loved tennis, he loved going running. He was incredibly talented. Like he was an artist, he was a musician. He played the trumpet, which at the time was like, come on, man, the trumpet. I mean, could you have picked a louder instrument to be playing? He was very talented at it. He like made his own music digitally, like movie scores he used to do, his photography, his art, his painting. Such a talented guy. I remember actually just after he died, I met someone that worked for or used to work for Disney, Pixar, and I showed her some of the work he did, and she was just like, God, I mean, even some of their their staff aren't as talented in art as he. He was unbelievably talented at art. So that was sort of him. I almost look back, I'm actually incredibly impressed by who he was. He had so much potential, which sort of makes it quite sad actually, because when I was reading the book, it was obviously incredibly, when I was writing the book rather, it was incredibly hard, some of the sections to write. And I went up to his room for the first time, first time in years, to be honest. I hadn't actually been up to his room for a long time because it all suddenly makes it real again. And I went up after writing, I think it was chapter 2, it was a hard chapter to write, and I sat there for ages and found his art book, and I was just flicking through the art book for a while, and the stuff he did was incredible, but it gets about halfway through, and then it's just a drawing he did with a note from his teacher saying something like, "This is great, A star," or whatever they say, and then it's just empty pages, and it's so heartbreakingly sad to think where he could have gone, what he could have done with that talent, and it sort of makes the whole thing seem even worse, and just directs that that drive for me back to what I do is because, you know, if we're talking 6,000 suicides a year, how many incredibly talented individuals are we losing? How much potential are we losing for people that are potentially incredibly talented, like Sam was? But he was, yeah, the memory I'm going to live with now, because it's taken a long time for this to become the memory that I remember about him, is the fact that he was incredibly funny. He was in a potentially quite controversial way. He was very funny, but and very talented, and that's the memory I have front and center. But obviously, it's taken a long time for that to take front and center.
I can imagine, obviously, it goes without saying, and it sounds almost too obvious to say, but I can only imagine how difficult the recovery process was for you. But the process of writing the book, can you describe your feelings about your experience with processing Sam's suicide before you wrote the book, and then potentially afterwards? And were there any significant changes once you'd gone through that process?
Wow. Okay. So I used to get asked this a lot. So I started campaigning in 2018. So I started doing interviews quite soon after that. And I remember all the interviews they'd ask me, "Oh, how are you? How are you coping?" I always used to say, "Oh yeah, I'm coping okay. I'm doing this and this ABC to cope." And it was, I wouldn't say it was a lie, but I think it was a sort of perception I wanted to give people that I was coping. And I don't think I was sharing very much. I think for a long time, my coping mechanism actually was to just pretend nothing happened, which seems ironic because I was very much not pretending it happened by campaigning. But like I said about going to Sam's room, I didn't want it to be real. And actually, a lot of the way I was looking at dealing with it was the fact that I wasn't dealing with it at all. I just pretended it didn't happen. It took me a very long time, I think, to realize not just that I needed to process it, but actually it took me a long time to get the bravery to understand how to process it. And that started actually when I met a lovely counsellor called Lucy, and we did a lot of work together. I think I had 6 months of counselling, and this was some few years after Sam had died. And that was the start actually of me understanding, because for me, a big part of the way I've dealt with this and understood it is actually understanding how this all works, and understanding trauma and understanding grief, and just understanding that our brains are actually pretty impressive, and the reasons why these feelings come up. So counselling for me was awesome. So that's kind of what I did before the book. And I'm really glad actually, because I was going to write the book a long time ago, probably a year and a half ago. I'm really glad we waited until after I'd gone through that, because actually a lot of what I talk about in the book is based purely on the conversations I've had during my counselling. But then the book happened, and wow, that was an incredible opportunity to sit there with thoughts that I hadn't really touched for a long time, and analyse it and write about it. And God, I can't find a way of explaining how that felt. It was awful. There were so many times where I was like, what am I doing? I really don't want to write this book. This is awful. I feel this is absolutely awful. So many times I couldn't sleep, and it was absolutely awful, some of these things writing, because it brought up so much for the first time. But in a way, looking back, I'm so glad I did that. I'm so glad I did that, because I so desperately needed to get that out and get that on paper and just read it back to myself and go, that's needed to have been said for myself. And I've said constantly that the book was written to help other people. I think I said it at the start of this, but oh my goodness, what it did to help me. It helped me to no end, in that it got stuff on paper that I hadn't really talked to people about before, and I was able to sit with that, think about it, and actually react to how I was, and react and process what I was writing. It was actually incredible, although incredibly difficult at sometimes as well.
Self-serving therapy in some form, isn't it? It's why journaling's so powerful, so popular, and such a up and coming form of calibrating yourself on a day-to-day basis, I guess. But the reason I ask that question is because I know that through public speaking, through sharing my story over various mediums over time, there's been questions I've been asked that I hadn't considered until the question was asked, and then I've thought about it a certain way. I thought, actually, how do I feel about that? And then the emotion comes back. I'm like, wow, I thought that was gone. So it's understanding that it's ever evolving, and I can imagine what your answer is going to be to this. But where are you at in terms of coming to terms with it? Is it something has the pain settled, or are you just used to the pain?
This is a really good question. I don't, and you said you know what I'm going to answer. I don't really know what I'm going to answer. I think, to be honest, I'd be very quick to say I am okay with it now and I have processed everything. But I don't. I think that'd be a lie. I don't think so. I think certain situations come up and certain things come up and certain thoughts come up that still. When I was having counselling, the way I described a difficult feeling, or the way I described having those intrusive thoughts, was it felt like I'd been stung by a bee, but not the bee sting wasn't just local; it was like a bee sting across my whole body. That's how I used to describe it to when I was like, oh, I've just come across something that stung me. That still comes up every so often. I've been very good at, especially publicly, with interviews and stuff. I'm very good at sort of stepping back and not letting myself go all out,
being objective, I'd imagine, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely not bearing all, but certainly in everyday life, and certainly around this time, and especially with my social media presence and the messages I get sometimes, certainly sometimes you get a little bit of a sting in terms of, oh, I wasn't expecting that to feel like that. But the difference now is those moments aren't treated as, oh, let's avoid that. They're an opportunity for me to be like, oh, hang on, there was something there. Let's just have a think about that for a second. And I know now how to process those moments. But no, absolutely, I don't think I don't think you ever really come to terms with this sort of thing because it's such a massive change to your life. I don't think I ever will come to terms with it in that I'm okay with it having happened, or understood that it's happened. It still seems bizarre that this all happened to me, but I know now when those thoughts come in how to deal with them, and that's what I didn't know back then. But they don't go away. It's still 4 years. It's 4 years is not actually that long. It feels like a long time because we've had a pandemic in the middle of it, but it's not a very long time. So there's definitely things that still come up.
I think as well, it's probably fair to say that you've packed a lot into those 4 years in terms of really confronting this head on, much more than your average person on the street. But it's probably worth diving into that because, again, we've already covered the sort of self-serving elements of these things, not from a selfish point of view, but just from, again, I've known firsthand that campaigning like this is very intrinsically valuable as well as extrinsically valuable. So first real initiative that's obviously built into something much bigger, it's raised over £100,000, but I think your first real tangible initiative was Walk the Talk, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So do you want to just talk us through the concept, how you came up with the idea, what the value you want to get from it, and then ultimately the experience itself?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, look, when Sam died, a lot of the messages I got initially were, "Hi, Ben. Sorry to hear about the news, blah, blah, blah. Really hope you're okay. If there's anything you need, let me know." And there became a moment a few weeks after Sam died that all of those messages, all of them changed to, "Hi, Ben. I'm not okay and I need to talk." And it was honestly, it was amazing to see that, transition. And I saw all of these people in my life, a lot of my friends, a lot of the people I was around, talking about how they had something going on they wanted to talk about, and I really just, having seen what could have happened to them, I wanted to give them the space to talk. And I used to do quite a lot of walking things. I loved walking, hiking. I was in the cadets at school. I was in Duke of Edinburgh. Blah, blah, blah. I loved walking, and I always found when you're walking, it sort of takes down the barriers to address difficult topics. Like having a DMC while you're walking is so much easier than if you were to sit there in a room on a like one of those school chairs and have that conversation. It was so much easier when you're walking. So I was like, let's do a walk and get people talking. But then another part of me was like, I'm a positive person. Like, I like having a laugh. I like color. Although I'm wearing black here, like I like bright colors, and I like having fun, and I like being positive. And at that point in my life, there was none of that. Everything was dark. Everyone was crying. Everyone was upset. It was just sad and negative. And I was like, I just want something positive to do. And so we did Walk to Talk. I got a group of my friends involved. They absolutely loved it. They jumped on it. The colour was bright pink. We wore bright pink the whole time we were doing it. It ended up being a 200-kilometre walk over 10 days from our school to London, the Houses of Parliament. And we just tried to encourage as many people to talk about their mental health while we were walking. And I think we raised initially £15,000 on the walk, and then we had 450 people walk. It was crazy, and then the response afterwards was just incredible. The number of people that spoke for the first time or that sought help for the first time was just so rewarding.
And the ripple effect from that as well. If you
Yeah.
can look at that as 450 people, but actually if you then look at the sort of the broader slipstream of that could be thousands, could be tens of thousands, and the impact that that's had from now 4 years on could have saved a life, could have saved more than a life, which is amazing. So you developed that over time, didn't you? And then ultimately, one of your more recent campaigns, initiatives, shall we say, was petition for significantly amount more mental health first aiding in just society in general. I think it's fair to say. So again, do you want to talk us through how you isolated that as something that you think would be a significant solution in the UK, and then how you went about it?
Yeah. So when the walk stopped, we saw the response had. The response was huge. Everyone loved it. Everyone was talking. That people absolutely loved the fact that had happened, and that we had so much support from everyone. And I remember it was only meant to be a one-off. Like I was meant to go to uni and then sort of forget about it all, and then go and get my corporate job somewhere. I don't know what would have happened, But that was not meant to. This is not what I had planned at all. And then I started talking to teachers. I started talking to Sam's teachers, to my teachers. And I realized very quickly that they had absolutely no idea how to help. They had absolutely no idea. And they told me that they see students struggling in their classroom all the time, and they just don't know how they can help them. And some of them said they don't want to try and help because they're worried they might say the wrong thing, which I hear all the time. And for me, a teacher is the best placed person in our society to be trained in how to spot the symptoms of something like this happening. They are absolutely the best, because we spend more time as kids around teachers than we do our parents and our family, for the most part, right? So they seem like the best placed people to be trained. So my idea was to create the petition because at the time the government's plan for teacher training, for mental health first aid training, was to take one teacher out of school, put them on their course, the 2-day course, and then send them back to school. And then that whole school was ticked as being mental health first aid trained because it had one mental health first aider in it. And that still, to me, seems absolutely bizarre that anyone thought that was an ambitious goal, or was going to be in any way useful. One teacher cannot look after the whole mental health of an entire 2,000 pupil school. That's absolutely absurd. So my idea was to, instead of take teachers out of school and put them back in and consider that school trained, make it part of teacher training. For lots of reasons, that is then a very sustainable model, in that you do that once, you pass that law, you get the structure in place, and that is just churning out teachers that are trained anyway, and slowly you fill the profession up with people that are trained. But also, it's very cost effective. It's very, very cost effective. We talk a lot about funding and mental health budgets, and everyone's like, oh, but where's the money coming from? Pass the law that puts the obligation on teacher training organizations to put this into their training. That's pretty cost effective to me. So for me, it was just an absolute no-brainer to give teachers that ability to help. It has been 3 years, and we're still not there. But
is it over 300,000 signatures though, or is it closing on
312,000 signatures? I think it's on at the moment. We went to Downing Street. We met the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister was like, "Oh, this is vital," was his word, and then never heard back.
My next question was. I'm not wanting to get political in any sense, because that's a dangerous topic at the moment. But from a personal point of view, going into that conversation, what were your expectations and hopes? And when you left the conversation to now, what has been the perspective shift that you've had? Do you feel more personally responsible because perhaps some faith has diminished somewhat, if that makes sense? I hope that's a delicately worded question without leaning one direction or the other, but I can imagine, from what I've gathered, from what I've seen on social media, the expectations of that meeting and the promises made, the conversation had, hasn't unfolded in the way that you necessarily would have hoped. So how has that reframed what you're doing now?
Absolutely, and you're right. I think it's like, I've tried very, very hard. It's very difficult sometimes, but I've tried very, very hard to be non-partisan, and I don't think that's helpful to get into politics, because it just creates barriers. And look, I'm going to talk to anyone that wants to help. I don't care what colour rose they wear on certain days of the year. I really couldn't care less. But I had a lot of faith when we got given that meeting. When I met the Prime Minister, I'll be honest, he really surprised me with how much he listened. He really surprised me with how much he seemed to care. He really, that really surprised me. Um, and we got given the meeting in Downing Street, and I thought, here we go. We're gonna create change. We're in the most important office in this country. This is huge. We're gonna create a change here. And we got there, and we had the meeting. And to be honest with you, it was actually very emotional for me, because it was like, wow, we're really on the precipice of creating a huge landslide here. We can actually help people, and that's the goal. We had the meeting, and they very much were of the opinion that they were already doing this, which I know for a fact they're not. But because they thought,
statistics are plain as day, really, aren't they?
yeah, and it's just a completely different approach that we were suggesting and petitioning for, rather than what they were doing. So, they sort of passed it off as they had already ticked the box because of that, and because they claimed they were already doing it. Then there's no obligation for it to go to Parliament for a debate. So, the buck sort of all ended, but it ended with the Prime Minister saying this is vital. I mean, I explained very clearly what our goal was. I explained very clearly what we were trying to achieve, and why we were trying to achieve it, and why I thought the government's plan was unsustainable. He said it was vital. Like, come on, man. If it's that vital, at least have a follow-up email. At least have a follow-up answer. At least let your, senior education advisor that I spoke to, at least make her at least look into the fact that this is a new suggestion, because it's just unsustainable what they're doing. They're creating more stress for teachers. They're not actually creating impact the way I see it, because one teacher in a school can't do anything. I've got this solution that is cost effective, that is sustainable, and no one even looked over it twice. But I'm still very much working on it, and the book it's mentioned very, very heavily in the book, and I want the book to be out there, because I want to draw that attention back to the fact that this is not a thing that's happening, and it was very much passed over. No one really considered it.
Well, the bigger lesson here is obviously that you've had that being right on the precipice, only to feel like it's just fallen short. I can imagine it's a very hard thing to bounce back from, but I can now imagine that the book is a secondary delivery mechanism to continue that message. Because if a petition hasn't necessarily got you to the point that you can, it's almost, for want of a better phrase, powers to the people, because we're potentially attaching ourselves to certain political directions at that point. But nonetheless, I think the book is trying to empower individuals to take a bit more control day to day, which is probably a key part of my message more so. I think your message is much more institutional and operational from that level, whereas I'm from a very human, lacking fulfillment point of view, experience of depression, trying to urge people to reconsider things in their own lives. So on that note, what have you isolated through this experience, the journey you've been on through processing Sam's death and everything you've learned since then? What are the things day to day that you think individuals can change to have an impact in their own lives? And then we'll come back afterwards to the more macro level considerations.
Lots. There's a lot that we need to change, because I think we're sort of brought up. No one talks about it. No one really is educated on it, which is an entirely separate problem. And I don't think we truly understand our mental health at all. Most everyday people. There's so much we need to change. I think the first thing, and probably the biggest thing that I would encourage people to look at, is their own internal monologue. And like when I was going through counselling, this is the one thing that came up time and time again, is what I was saying to myself internally. Awful. I was saying some really not nice things to myself. And I think a lot of people are doing the same. And a really good example of this that I loved and is in the book is with anxiety. Everyone has anxiety. It's a very, very normal emotion. Obviously there are anxiety disorders, which is separate, but everyone has anxiety. And a lot of people that feel anxious beat themselves up for feeling anxious. And public speaking is a great example of this. How many people have had to do a public speaking event, like at school or at work, and have sat there before going on, feeling anxious, palm sweaty, and have gone to themselves, why are you feeling, why are you, like, this is just, stop being anxious, this is stupid, there's not even that many people. And sort of had that really negative, why are you, just snap out of it, stop being anxious. Everyone does it. I used to do it all the time. Like, come on, Ben, it's only 10 people, like, come on, why are you being anxious, and get annoyed at yourself. A lot of people do that. But what that does is creates this this spiral where you have that negative thought pattern, and it just becomes worse and worse and worse, and the anxiety gets worse and worse and worse. And the best way of dealing with that, and the best way of changing your internal conversation, is to be compassionate and empathetic, and kind to yourself. So if you're in the same position, so let's use the same example, public speaking, you're feeling anxious. What is anxiety? Anxiety is literally there. It is wired into your brains to keep you safe. It is an emotion that is derived from the fact that it's trying to keep you safe from difficult things. So recognize that. And my advice is to thank the anxiety. Be like, yeah, cheers, boss. Thanks for this, trying to keep me safe. But I'm okay. I'm not going to get hurt. I'm not at physical risk. I'm not in danger. And but be compassionate about that. Not beat yourself up or beat your brain up for trying to keep you safe. It's absurd. But too many people are very, very quick to be very negative towards themselves and beat themselves up. And a lot of people actually encourage these sorts of conversations. There's a lot of social media posts that I see from like motivational accounts where I'm like, yeah, that's not a good way of motivating yourself. Beating yourself up for doing or not doing things is just a useless exercise, because it doesn't actually change anything, and it doesn't encourage you to do anything differently, and it certainly doesn't help your mental health. So the biggest thing I would say is really reflect on what you're saying to yourself, because I think a lot of the mental health problems we face in society right now can be stemmed from what you're saying to yourself. If not, the reason that your mental health becomes worse is because of how you're talking about, difficult things that are happening internally.
The perpetual nature of that is something that really was part of my downfall, to be perfectly honest. The way that I've actually just got off a call with the Law Society of Scotland earlier today, so talking to lawyers about my experience, and one of the things that I reflected upon more than I normally do. I don't specifically know why I did today, but it was the negative self-talk that I was experiencing when I was feeling a certain way. I have a roof over my head, I've got a loving family, I've got friends, I can afford to pay for things, etc., etc. I've grown up privileged, all these things. Why do you feel this way, you dickhead? You're useless. You shouldn't feel like this. There's other people that are much worse off and they don't feel like this, you moron. And it just got so out of control because I allowed it to get so out of control. But one thing recently, I've always been confident, but depression really made me not confident. So once I got to that point, I opened up myself to be hit really quite hard by that negative self-talk. It still creeps in now, but something I found that's really, really useful. I can't remember who said it. I feel like it was a Greek philosopher, but that might be wrong. It's hard to know who's passing off what off as their quote and others these days. But it was reframing anxiety about situations as your body processing it as excitement, and that feeling is excitement at the opportunity and about how it's about to happen. Because none of the anxiousness I've ever felt ahead of something has ever come to fruition.
Yeah.
So all of the catastrophizing and all of the negativity bias that we're hardwired to have as humans has never come to pass. And that's happened enough times to give me the confidence and the faith that actually what I'm feeling is excitement at the opportunity of what's about to happen, or excitement at the unknown, that I'm actually leaning into fear a little bit. And I think what you've done so excellently is you started from a clean slate and you just lent into that fear over and over again. And I can imagine done it without much time to process and think between, to the point where now the feeling of anxiety you get is just something that you can think, oh, there it is again, off we go. But I think the big thing there is exposure, isn't it? And that's why I'm so big at encouraging people to put themselves out of the comfort zone, which is what Walk the Talk would have done for those around you. So what have been the more macro level considerations? Obviously, you've isolated one through the mental health first aid solution in schools, but are there any other broader considerations that you've considered, spoken with others about, anything else at a much higher level that you think needs done? And if so, any suggestions? As I'm sure they're in the book, but anything you want to flesh out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many things that need to change. I think, well, for me, it comes down to the fact that I don't think we should be learning this in a book by a 22-year-old. This should not be learnt now. And all these methods, we talk about the anxiety thing, the self-talk, all of these things. These should be things that are taught in school, And I know the government introduced the new mental health curriculum for all key stages last September. So everyone is now getting taught about mental health in schools, but they're also not teaching teachers how to teach it. So teachers are still not being trained, but they're encouraged or they're required now to teach about mental health. And so all these things, the positive self-talk, the positive internal monologue, all this stuff that, being able to talk. How do you talk? What is an emotion? What is depression? What are the symptoms of this? What do you do if you're feeling like this? Like all of this stuff that people need to know, I think desperately need to know, to just go about normal life, not just to stop people from getting mentally ill, but to stop people, to allow people to live a normal life. That's getting taught in schools, but it's being taught by people that aren't taught. And so again, it comes back to what I'm calling on the government to do, is just train teachers, because the PSHE Association literally came out with a report and says teachers that aren't trained in the subject teaching PSHE lessons are literally risking making the stigma and actually making the whole problem worse. Because let's face it, how many times have we been in a sex ed class and everyone's just laughed about it? And I remember when we had sex ed, someone got slapped in the face by a blue dildo, and it was all really funny and really stigmatized, and it helped no one. It helped no one. And I keep going back to, like, imagine if you had the same situation for a mental health class where everyone was laughing about it and everyone was making jokes about it. Like, that is not helping anyone, and it's actually making it so much worse. And that's what we risk at the moment. So in terms of the wider, bigger picture stuff, we have to train teachers. Then the NHS, where do we start with that? I think, the fact that people have to wait so long for support is absolutely appalling. Absolutely appalling, because the way I see it, it is totally preventable. It is absolutely preventable, in terms of, not just in terms of adding more funding, because it's very, very easy to say, oh, we need more funding, but you can pour money into a hole and it just disappears and disappears and disappears. There are very, very innovative projects that are running that are incredibly good at taking demand off the NHS. The mental health support hubs for schools. I've spoken to a teacher, a mental health lead in a school the other week about that, and actually it filled me with incredible hope, because he said the stories he was telling about the support hub were just incredible. The fact that we've got mild to moderate mild to moderate struggling children had access to CAMHS support within a day. They were referred to this early support hub by this head of mental health in this school, and they were contacted by the CAMHS team the day after they were referred, because of this new initiative, because it's so efficient and it's so good at dealing with that. And if you can deal early and intervene early with these people, then you save them from having to go to the main NHS CAMHS later on. This is a new way of looking at it. But then again, you come back to the government's role in this. They've set the target for those support hubs at 30% coverage. Their goal is to cover the country 30%. Like, that's not a goal. That's a milestone, sure, but that's not a goal. So there's lots of things that I need to, and then obviously the universities and university support. There's so much, and it's all covered in the book. But I think beyond anything, it's just, I think a lot of people in charge, whether they're in charge of schools, whether they're in charge of the country, whether they're in charge of universities, they just need to understand, when we say mental health needs to be a priority, what does that really mean? It means that every single decision you make, or every single conversation you have, or every single meeting you have about anything, regardless of how separate an issue it seems, someone needs to bring up the mental health thing. Someone needs to bring up how it affects people. Someone needs to look at how best you can support people's mental health through that. And that's a position I think we need to try and get into. But yeah, there's quite a lot that needs to change. It's been a busy 4 years, and I'm sure it'll be a busy 4 years going forward as well. But this, yeah.
What does the next 4 years look like? I don't want to distract from the excitement of the moment and force you to exit the bubble of excitement from becoming an author, as we've already so rightly covered. But what are whether there's any specific plans or otherwise, what does the future look like for you? What would you like it to look like, rather?
Yeah. So for me, honestly, I think there's lots of things I'd like to do. It's that I don't know. I mean, obviously for me, this is all nothing's confirmed yet. This is all just my sort of ambition and my goal. And I love to do sort of 5-year plans and 5-year goals and sort of understand what I want to do. And a book was one of them. So that's been sort of ticked off, which is amazing. But obviously, you can going forward, the book is absolutely center to everything I want to do, to try and get that book into people's hands. We're launching the paperback next weekend next year. So we're going to have another drive next year for that. I really want to do more. Or actually, I want to do documentary. I really want to look into actually what's going on, because the reason I wanted to write a book was because there's only so much you can say in an Instagram caption, and the reason I wanted a documentary is there's only so much you can say in a 15-second video on social media. to really get into an issue and to really highlight an issue. That's something I really want to do. And there's lots of things like that, but it's all about trying to get issues that don't necessarily always get the spotlight into a spotlight. And with the book, that's exactly what I've tried to do. You know, when I was writing it, there was a lot of temptation to sort of take the well-trodden path in terms of a self-help mental health book, and I was like, no, we're gonna absolutely take the filter away from this, and we're gonna talk about things that people potentially haven't really thought of before, and perspectives people haven't thought of before. And I call it sort of the pretty versus the ugly conversation around mental health. And it's the same with everything I try to do. It's like, let's just take the filter away. I'm just going to say it as it is and paint the picture exactly as it is. Documentary book.
Which is bleak, isn't it?
It's awful.
That's ultimately what people want to shy away from, because it's scary and intimidating. But funnily enough, that's exactly, when I was part of the Roman Kemp documentary, that was exactly his vision for it was, look, my best friend is dead because of this crisis. And as you said, I totally agree, it's a crisis. And the exciting thing is I think it's a crisis we can have a tangible impact on. But for him, it was the reality of the situation is not being depicted accurately enough. So let's take that filter away and actually share the reality of that. And I think that's the only way, especially as blokes, we're going to have an impact on that, because one of the conversations I had earlier was how can men that are standoffish with the reality of the situation, how can they be brought in a little bit more? Because I think role models, I think conventional figures of strength, of masculinity, for those men that still identify with those sort of more traditional values, those are the people that can turn the tide a little bit with that general consensus, which actually leads quite nicely into a more conceptual question, which is, what is your take on modern masculinity? What would you define it as?
Wow. It's difficult, isn't it? I was thinking about this earlier. It's like, it's really, really hard to define. But if I was starting afresh and I was the first person alive and I was there choosing what masculinity looked like, I think it would be about strength, but it would be about strength in terms of what I believe strength is. And that's not necessarily physical strength. It can be, sure, but it's also the strength in yourself to be honest and to be open and to have emotions and to understand them and have emotional strength and emotional intelligence. And look, there are so many men now, so many more than I think people realize, in relationships especially, that think you have to do certain things and you have to be a little bit, avoid certain things and not talk about certain things. There's still so many people like that, and it's like, that doesn't help anyone. And I say it in the book. We've created a society that values stoicism and an illusion of toughness over the ability to cry. Like, come on. I mean, I would much prefer to have you as a friend if you were able to cry in front of me and able to show emotions. That is huge. And I respect people so much more that can have that strength, because being able to show your emotions, that is an incredibly brave thing to do. And it comes back to what I love to say is that the biggest misconception I think there is about suicide and mental health and emotions is that people that struggle are weak, and people that have had suicidal thoughts and are suicidal or have attempted suicide, they are in some way defective or weak. I have met so many people like yourself that have been in those places, and without a doubt, they are the strongest, most inspiring people I've ever met. Without a doubt, they are so strong. They are so strong. To get through something like that, even for one day, to have those thoughts and to be able to get through somehow, that is a huge thing. That is incredibly brave and incredibly strong. So if I was making masculinity from anything, it is being able to understand emotions, to be able to be emotionally intelligent. That is strength like I don't know in a lot of ways, to get through those sorts of things. And that's what a man is, in my perspective.
I agree almost entirely. I think the one thing I would add is the benefit of stoicism in interpreting the emotions can be very useful by applying an almost neutral analytic of, right, why did I feel the way that I did? What do I do next? How do I understand these emotions, and how do I carry that into my life for moving forwards? And funnily enough, it's actually ex-military, ex-Sergeant Major of the SBS, Gaz Bamford, who's been on the podcast before. He talks very openly about this stuff, and he is one of the hardest men I've ever met, funnily enough.
Yeah.
And he has a concept just called neutral thinking, and looking at things objectively, letting the emotion to settle, feeling that emotion, embracing that emotion, and then actually looking at it for what it is, then making your decisions following that. And for me, that's a really positive way of me dealing with the stress of my day-to-day existence, and actually very much feeds into I think self-awareness is a real part of being a modern man in my mind. But that only comes through variety of experience and leaning into things that are a little bit uncomfortable, like the ugly conversations around mental health that a lot of people are avoiding. So in the same vein of sort of masculinity thread of DNA, yes or no question, no wrong answer.
Okay.
Do you have ambitions at this stage in your life of being a father in the future?
Yes.
Okay. What world would you like your child to be brought up in?
Oh, difficult one, isn't it? I think a world that, I think in terms of, look, I know that I'm going to be, well, I don't know necessarily, but I would like to think that I'm going to be able to bring my child up to be emotionally intelligent, and to be able to talk to me about things, and to be able to cry in front of me, and probably, let's face it, for me to cry in front of him, if ever we watch Finding Nemo, that'll be me blubbing away. So that'll be that.
Rightly so. Hard watch. Watch.
Oh God, when he gets the eggs and he's the last one every time. So I definitely. I mean, that is that. I think I have control over whether I paint how I paint, especially if it's a son. How I paint what a man is, or how we emotionally intelligent in that way. But I think in a wider sense, I want to get to a point where you go to school and you don't feel the same pressure that I did, that my brother did. You don't feel the same intense, excruciatingly intense pressure to fit in, to be someone that you're not. It's actually sad looking back at the people I was at school with, and if I'm really analytical about it, the number of people I was at school with, that I interacted with, that looking back, and I didn't realise it is this at the time, but I do now, the number of people I met that were so not them, that were forcing themselves to be someone they were not at school, just so they could fit in, just so they could get through their day. So many people do that, and I'd love to get to a point where schools are so much more open and supportive, and a place that people can be themselves. So that's something I'd like to achieve, and I think that starts very much with training teachers and sort of tackling the culture we've got in schools. But then in terms of the world as well, social media, all of these things, they just need to be so much more inclusive, and inclusive of all people, and let people sort of be their own person, and stop putting these pressures on people to be different, or all of this. But yeah, I mean, and also I think people just cry more. Like, I cry all the time on my stories. I really do, and especially recently. It's been a lot.
What's going on?
But I don't. Right. But it, like, happy tears. I mean, especially with the book. Like, I've blubbed. I was on Lorraine, pretty much tearing up yesterday in front of millions of people. It's like I don't feel awkward about that at all. And I love that. I absolutely love that I've got to a position where thousands of people can watch something where I'm really emotionally vulnerable, and no part of me feels awkward about the fact that people see that. No part of me feels even remotely awkward about that. And I think a few years ago, I would have wanted to have deleted those videos, and I would have wanted that to not be there. And I love, for my kids, for other people's kids, for everyone, the next generation, to grow up with this feeling I've got now of I can be as emotional as I like in public, and not feel this urge to keep it private or to keep it behind closed doors. I'd love that for other people. I'd really love that. But I've managed to get myself to that position through the stuff that I teach in the book, about my story, my journey. But that, in a nutshell, is where I'd like the world to be potentially when my kids come in.
Well, you certainly push it.
God, that feels weird.
You're certainly pushing it in that direction.
For a few years, hopefully.
It's very conceptual. Apologies for sending you down that path of consideration, but here we are. It's something I often confront as well, which is why I asked, because it's fascinating to me how someone in the same space would consider it, and there's so many similarities, but you are very much pushing things in that direction from a grassroots level. Tell me to just be quiet if it's crossing any sort of boundaries in terms of reflections, but you mentioned the pressure of growing up and the pressure of being a young person in this day and age, and you mentioned earlier just how talented and the depth of Sam's sort of just the things he was good at was. Do you think that made the pressure even more overbearing because he didn't know what direction he could turn, he didn't know how to channel all that talent? Do you think it was almost a bit of a curse as much as it was a blessing?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think actually he was very excited with it because he had so many possibilities, and he was talking about doing an internship with this production company. He had a lot of potential there. So I don't necessarily think it was a pressure because of the talent, and no one put pressure on him either. Like there was no one behind the scenes being like, "Oh my God, you need to go and work for Disney. Oh my God, you need to go and do this." Like it was very much, "Hey, I like painting," and he probably would have said it exactly like that. But so there wasn't that pressure in terms of that. But what I think was a pressure, and I think actually a pressure that a lot of people can face, is you could be the most talented person in the world, and in terms of creative ability. And I often like to use or I think about if like Picasso was at school and was told by their teachers that they weren't going to pass exams, or didn't pass maths exams, didn't pass English exams, really struggled with words, really struggled with the academic subjects. I think actually the pressure for Sam wasn't in what his talents were and where he was going. Actually, I think it was about why he wasn't good at what everyone else was good at and why he wasn't academic. And I often think, like, if Picasso and all these famous artists were at school, I don't think a lot of them actually I think a lot of them would have faced the same pressure that a lot of people at the moment are doing, and a lot of them would have probably come away from school thinking they were some low level, really untalented person because they weren't able to sit English exams. I think we put pressure on young people in the wrong places, and I think actually part of that is due to this insane amount of pressure on university and higher education and academia. It's like that's absolute nonsense. It is nonsense. We've created a world where we have given creative people so much pressure to be someone they're not for their entire youth years, and then chuck them out in a world that is desperate for creatives. And it's like,
all to
it doesn't
fulfill
make any
some
sense.
arbitrary metrics of pieces of paper with numbers on them at the end of the day.
Precisely.
I was very drawn into that world, and we spoke about this before we jumped on air, but I'm pretty despondent with the university system in the UK and beyond a little bit, to be fair. I don't think university on premise is a bad thing, but I think the culture around how we should navigate young people towards university is probably wrong. I think it should very much be a case of capture the creativity and the talent of the young person when it starts to shine through, and then go all eggs in that basket with some supplementary, not backup, but some broader development for that person. I think, as you said, the limiting factors, GCSEs, to use an example, or whatever they're called now. They're called something different, but that stage of a young person's life, there's so much they don't know about themselves. There's so much they haven't even had a second to comprehend, yet they're being forced to make decisions that people our age and beyond don't even know. So I think the real challenge is stifling that creativity, because somebody might be fantastic at maths, but they've got to do English as well. And we know that actually, conventionally speaking, those sides of the brain don't necessarily speak to one another in the most synergistic way. So I think if somebody wants to, like I said before, if somebody wants to do a vocational degree because they're fascinated by it, what the university that sounds exciting to them, I don't think the merit of one university over the other, especially even in the eyes of employers these days, I don't think it's as much as value. I don't think the scale of it is quite as much as we're led to believe at school, which is something I try and put across, because I know, having gone through that system, I wish I'd gone to Loughborough to do sports science. Why? Because I was interested in sports science, not because I wanted to get the best white-collar job that I could, to get the most expensive mortgage that I could, to hate my life when I was 50 and then retire with enough money to then start living my life. And I think that's the biggest problem. But you've obviously spoken to, why don't you just tell us briefly, before we round up, your experience with the university and what you think the bigger considerations are?
Yeah, I love that. It's the world dream, isn't it? Get a expensive mortgage with a job you hate, with a life you hate, and then die. It's like, come on. But that's what everyone wants to do. And you like ask kids in school, they're like, what do you want to do? And they're like, become a banker and get a nice house and lots of cars. You're like, what? But this is so true, and this is why people go down the path. And look, there is a place for university. There definitely is. There's lots of incredible research that's done because of universities, and there's a lot of jobs that obviously owe themselves to universities, and you have to have them. But I think that the universities have almost become the default option at school for a lot of people. It's like, oh, I'm going to go to university. And I remember friends at school that weren't going to go to university, and they became the outsider. Like, why are you not going? And they were one of the only people. And I was like, looking back, I'm like, surely they should have been the ones that we were celebrating. Like, God, man, you're doing something outside the box. And I actually was speaking to someone the other day that was really interesting, that only hires people that haven't got a degree.
Interesting.
All because he's in the creative industry, and he's like, sorry, if you sit there in an interview and you tell me that you want to be unique and you think outside the box, and yet you went from school to university to study history degree, and then you got a master's, and it's like, sorry, at what point can you prove that you think outside the box? And it was really interesting talking to him, because it's like, actually, that's such a good point, because so many people want to be unique and want to be different and want to be the best in something, but they follow exactly the same path that everyone else talks about. And there's lots of other paths out there that you can do that don't require a degree and that don't need you to go there. And I think we are slowly making that shift, and people are realizing it. My university degree experience, very, very briefly, was I started doing aerospace engineering, realized I couldn't do any maths, and then dropped out. And now here I am.
Here we are, yeah.
But it took me 2.5 years to realize I couldn't do maths. 2.5 years of struggling so much to understand how everyone else just got it so easily. And we're talking maths that was like 6 hours for one question. 6 hours on one question, and I would get to the end of that 6 hours and I would hand my piece of paper in and I'd get it wrong, and I'd be like, "Ooh, this is just great, isn't it?" So I end up leaving, and so but do this full time, and I've landed in a career that I absolutely love. I absolutely love this. I love every single day of the work I do because it has impact. I don't have a degree, and I actually dropped out of uni to do this. I love it. And I think a lot more people would find exactly the same, actually, if they started exploring options that were out there in terms of their interests and their passions.
I completely agree. I handed in papers in theology and religion at Durham where I did not understand the arguments of the academics that I was splicing together and balancing against one another in the essay that I had written, and managed to get the grades that I needed to get a 2-1 in the end, which is just hilarious. 27 grand plus accommodation fees later. Here we are. But nonetheless, Ben, thank you very, very much for such an insightful and open conversation. Really, really massively appreciate you being so open and honest. It's not an easy thing to do, even when you've been doing it for as long as you have. So tell us exactly where we can get the book. I'll put details in the show notes, obviously, but where, in order of preference, where would you like people to find the book, and then where can they find you online?
Wow. Okay. So obviously the number one preference is your local bookshop. I know a lot of local bookshops have been doing it. Support local if you can. I don't know if all of them have them, but definitely worth checking out. Also, going to local bookshops is brilliant. Anyway, then Amazon, Waterstones, WH Smith, bookshop.org, all the usual bookshop places. It's in Sainsbury's as well, in store. So if you have a Sainsbury's nearby, then you can pick one up from there. It's called This Book Could Save Your Life, Breaking the Science Around the Mental Health Emergency. Obviously, it's all of the links are in the link in my bio on my Instagram as well. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much for having me on, Fergus, and for all your support over the last few years. It really, really means a lot.
Not at all. Thank you for a fantastic conversation, and I look forward to finishing your book.